It's my great joy to introduce Daniel Schmachtenberger to you all. Daniel is a wonderful polymath, really extraordinary public speaker who is the head of the Civilization Research Institute and co-founder of the Consilience Project, and is probably, this is kind of the personal story, there's two people in the last 5 years of my life that have really dramatically shifted my worldview, my spirituality, et cetera. And of people living people, I would say that Daniel and Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, have been the two kind of major shifts for me, and have greatly not only shifted my view of the world and what we need to be doing in it, but also have really grounded me spiritually, have shifted my kind of heart sense of how to relate. And so obviously, Daniel and I have met once before, but anytime I get to see Daniel, it's just a joy to bring him in, and a joy to introduce him to the Quaker Earthcare Witness community and all others. So QEW is an organization, a Quaker organization that focuses on Earthcare concerns. We're a global network, and we're really excited to bring Daniel in here today to talk about a civilizational rite of passage. And obviously, a rite of passage is something you don't know what the end of it is. You don't know if we're gonna make it, if we're not gonna make it. But what you can do is you can be faithful in the process. You can be true in the process. And I think that this being true is something that Daniel often refers to as deep earnestness. And so we're gonna sort of investigate today some of what Daniel calls the Metacrisis. It's a term that's kind of thrown in a number of sort of sense-making communities that are working on these large, big picture topics, and how seeing that Metacrisis, coming under the weight of that, how we can respond to it in a powerful and spiritual way. So with that, I just want to those are my opening comments, and I just want to invite Daniel. Do you have anything you want to share before we kind of dive in?
My mom went to a friend's school when she was a kid and always spoke very highly of her experience. And I had a mentor for a while when I was a kid named Dr. Everett Loomis. He was one of the kind of pioneers of natural medicine in the West, and got to live on a health retreat that he had when I was young, and he was a Quaker. And so I have not got to experience Quaker community very much myself, but I have very positive associations. And so it was cool when you told me about this. And I, if my schedule was not overfull with timely things we're working on, I would have joined you for the whole day, because I like the tone of what you shared with me that you're exploring here together. The spirituality that is in service of ecology, life, well, with deep earnestness and deep humility. So being that you've had a full day and I haven't had all that, I hope that this weaves, and I'm just happy to be here. And I also said yes to coming just because of the way that in our limited interaction, talking once, but also just the way I've seen you post online, it was clear that you are a very caring, thoughtful, earnest person, and I like to support activities of people like that.
Yeah, I think Daniel, some of the people in our community have probably heard me say things like, humanity has reached a point where we've become too powerful to remain in rivalry with ourselves, and that the problem is that we have a profound gap between our capacities as a species and the wisdom that guides them. And I would say that of everyone I attribute that sort of framing to, it's you. And I think that the really extraordinary thing is that you bring out that framing, not just as a way to understand our own times and what needs to be done in them, but also as a way of understanding of how we got here. How did a species that clearly does not want to destroy its own climate do that collectively nonetheless, right? How is it that collective decisions that no one would want end up becoming, almost unavoidable? Like the momentum is so extraordinary that nothing can seem to overcome it. And so if we can kind of talk about that and talk about its relation, this is what Daniel calls the Metacrisis. and talk about how that relates to our understanding of history. I just want to open that to you. What is the Metacrisis, and where are we in that?
Yeah, I'll just share in starting that in general, I don't like talking about this publicly because it's mostly not empowering and just kind of despair causing uselessly. I mostly talk about it to institutions and philanthropists and whatever, where there's something they can do and try to tailor it to what they can do. It's not that there isn't any way we can relate to it more effectively. We come to understand the whole picture more. It's devastating before it's empowering. It can be motivating and ennobling, but it also, the analysis shows that most of the things that one could be hopeful about won't work. And so there's a lot of faith actually required to want to engage with that in a meaningful way, because you have to go through a kind of crucible to come out on the other end in some way empowered. And I think it's because there's a spiritual practice and a community holding each other here that I feel okay talking about it. You're mentioning climate change and, this kind of obligate nature. The first scientific paper on climate change was published in 1938. The United Nations Environmental Program recognizing the need for international coordination on global commons issues was made in 1972. Well over 50 years ago. And climate change has become one of the biggest existential risk topics in the world. It has over $1 trillion a year in climate funding. And with the exception of global recessions, every single year we use more fossil fuels than the year before. And during that whole time, all of the solar, wind, renewable energy, all the hydro and the damaging effect of the dams, and all of the nuclear and the entire risk of the nuclear energy hasn't even slowed the increase in fossil fuels use 1 year. And so when you look at, and yet the most fascinating thing is there's literally no one who wants climate change as like a strategic objective. Yes, you can say that the Russians are capitalizing on the fact that they get a new shipping route through the Arctic. But no one has climate change as an objective, and yet nobody can stop it. Because everybody wants energy, because energy is 1-for-1 correlated with GDP and thus ability to actuate anything. And money has to exponentially grow every year to keep up with the interest, which means that the energy demand has to exponentially grow every year. And the solar plant is going to take 10 years worth of the energy that it produces out of fossil fuel energy to make up front. And then we don't decide to make less fossil fuel energy. We just make all of the stuff in which there is energy return on energy investment. While there are plenty of groups that don't care enough about species extinction, nobody really wants species extinction. And nobody really wants PFAS in literally every raindrop in the world, which it is now, as an ubiquitous carcinogen and stuff. Or there's 230 million chemicals in the American Chemical Society database. Almost all of them are toxic. Carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, whatever. The curve of the increasing autoimmune diseases, the increasing autism, the increasing Alzheimer's, the increasing psychiatric diseases follows the curve of those chemicals. And nobody wants a toxic planet, and also nobody can stop it. And the total set of all activities that has been done since Silent Spring was written, since the environmental movement started, we have put more toxic chemicals each year into the environment than the year before, and innovated more new ones. And it's not just that the processes have been ineffective, it's that many of them have made things worse. Right? That if we say, okay, because of climate change and fossil fuel use, we really need to push non-fossil fuel energy. So we push more nuclear. And so now we get increased risk of warfare associated with nuclear and toxic waste and et cetera, and it doesn't slow fossil fuels. And then you do more dams, and so you destroy more ecosystems and create more geopolitical tensions between the countries that share the river. It's typically the case that the way that we go about solving the problems doesn't work and makes them worse. And I didn't have that analysis when I was young and started and was kind of like hopeful that we could just put more energy into the things. So why? Like, why is this? I would also say when you were talking, you mentioned that there are certain kind of like principles that come from conscience that were things people could choose before, but they're obligate now because self-termination on this path is the otherwise impending possibility. I wouldn't even say that they were possible before, they were impossible. Because if you held a set of views that did not mount effective military forces, and Genghis Khan and his men, or Alexander the Great, or the Ottomans, or whatever were coming, you were slaughtered. And there have been a lot of peaceful, beautiful cultures throughout history that listened to their conscience and got slaughtered. We just did an analysis of this on, the history of selection via warfare. And, Genghis Khan and his men alone in his life, not the entire Mongols, killed 50 million people on horseback without nuclear weapons, without industrial weapons, killed 50 million people. That was 11% of the entire global population, including lots of lovely cultures that, because they were lovelier, didn't mount huge militaries. And fascinatingly, it's actually a really just weird irony that the current estimate is that 11% of all Asians today are Genghis Khan's descendants, because the amount of rape that he and then the genetics of that family did. So kill the people, do all the raping. So, and then when you look at that for Dutch colonization in the Congo and Attila and blah, 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 you realize that we alive today are the descendants, mimetically and genetically, of the most successful conquerors. And that the Tibetans could keep a relatively nice set of ideas as long as they were remote enough that nobody cared about their land that much. And as soon as it became clear that they controlled the watershed between 2 billion person populations, then a violent culture slaughtered them. And the same with the Native Americans and the colonizers here. The population of North and South America before colonizers came was 140 million people, and colonization wiped out over 90% of them. That's a lot of people. And that means those ways of being, those non-alphabetic languages, those non-written languages, those systems of medicine, those poetries, all of that, wiped out of history. So I don't think it was possible. Like, an individual could try to be lovely and a tribe could try to be lovely, but you didn't actually make it through history that way. And you most certainly didn't shape the world very much that way. And so this topic of the, kind of a multipolar trap, somebody does something that provides so much near-term competitive advantage that everyone else is obligated to do that or lose. And lose means your ideas don't make it through selection. That has been an amazingly powerful part of a very perverse selection process. And this is still the case. And this is why OpenAI, that was founded because of the fear of market-driven AI and the need to make a very well-funded research institute to focus on slowing down market AI risk, became the company, like switched from a nonprofit to a for-profit and accelerate AI risk more than any. Yeah. And it's why then, seeing that was happening and saying it was bad, a part of OpenAI broke off, created Anthropic to really do AI risk work. and then realized that in order to do that, they needed a lot of money to have big AI systems. They took the money, became a for-profit, and now are also racing. And so, again, what happened is pretty much everyone got into the multipolar trap of the dude with more power wins. There is no way out of this. And unless you want to just die with dignity, we have to win, and we have to do whatever violent, etc. thing is going to let us win, but then we'll be the good guys. And this is basically the state of geopolitics between US and China right now. And many, many places. So in that way, ethics are constraints on strategic possibilities. And those who have less of them have less constraints and thus win at strategy. And so one cannot afford to have them, right? Which is why there are so many realpolitik theorists who basically say, if you have any ethics, you're an asshole. Because what you're actually saying is that you don't care about anything enough to be effective.
Yeah.
And if you really want to be effective, you have to win, and you got to do what it takes. So if you care, you'll be you'll do the Machiavellian thing. Which is such a weird, basically it's what happened to Saruman in Lord of the Rings, right? It's what happens again and again. Power winning is inevitable. And therefore, embracing it is actually ethical because it's your only way to influence it. And so that's the co-opting of the ethics, right? But what's the other choice? So there's a way in which just choosing to die with dignity, we'll be ethical, our hands will be clean while the world burns. Yeah. And if you look at the history, the Jane Goodalls of the world have not had the level of influence on the world system the Kissingers have had. Not by 1 billion to 1. And the minds and heart, the developmental process that makes a Jane Goodall does not give you Kissinger skills. The developmental process that gives you Kissinger skills does not give you Jane Goodall values. They are almost developmentally mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And yet we don't make it if we don't actually get both of those in the same beings now. But where those skills are not in service to power and the perpetuation of the system, but are in service to all sentience now and into perpetuity. But that's that heart and that mind together, right? In the same beings. And yeah, so right now, we obviously, the crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries radically, rapidly crossing the other ones. All of the curves are accelerating. If we tried to turn it around, it's not even clear that we could. Nobody really understands. And obviously, the post-war order that maintained relative peace between superpowers, meaning we only proxy warred through Korea and Vietnam and whatever other places, and economic warfare and et cetera, that has completely broken down. That kind of post-war order is not effective anymore at preventing major power conflict. And so we can see that we have multiple pre-World War III escalation pathways hot right now, which is why the atomic scientists moved the nuclear clock closer to midnight than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we see actually an increase in hawkishness everywhere. And if you look at just even the rate of, say, AI, and the reason that AI is so important more than any other category of tech, it's because I can't use a nuclear weapon to make a bioweapon. I can't use a nuclear weapon to make a financial system. I can't use a bioweapon to make a financial system. I can use AI to make better nukes and better bioweapons and better financial systems and better manufacturing and better propaganda. So the race there, Moore's law was completely unprecedented in history, doubling the computing power every 2 years. But every 18 months. So you get an exponential curve. Currently, just the hardware alone on GPUs is 10xing the compute efficiency every 6 months. Not to mention that you also have an exponential curve on the software, on the amount of data, on the parameters. And so and this is why there's, been about 30 trillion just invested in the last couple of years, trillion, to win AI supremacy as the ring to rule them all. And nobody who thinks they can win has any interest in multilateral agreements to slow it down.
Absolutely.
So you could say these are times that were prophesized. You could say that the end of Kali Yuga and the beginning of the possible beginning of Sat Yuga, you could say the time of purgatory or the end of the Mayan calendar or whatever, we're all roughly speaking to a similar thing. And you could say that once you got the written word, so you got history, like a more kind of formal version of history, it wasn't that hard for philosophers of the time to recognize that with populations increasing, the wars killed more people. Because the number of people that Genghis Khan killed was more than the entire world population at the beginning of the agricultural revolution. Like, just to have a sense, right? So with the increasing population, kill more people. With the increasing technology, we kill more people from a further distance, right? You get the crossbow, you get the cannon, you get the phalanx, and it's pretty clear to see that humans were not very good stewards of their power, right? Every culture had class subjugation, torture, whatever. Once we got into empire, not pre-empire. And so the idea that we have that kind of mixed bag of some really lovely stuff, but really wicked stuff, but that the wicked stuff is getting larger populations with more tech. And the wars are killing more people. And we're like, early civilizations were destroyed because of environmental overshoot. Right? If you read Tainter and the Collapse of Complex Civilizations, you can see that cutting down all the trees, eroding the topsoil, and then the civilization fails has been happening for thousands of years. So, but obviously, with the capacity to destroy environments at larger scale, the beginning of big belly ships and greater fishing and blah, blah, blah. So you could prophesize, hey, this time is going to come to an end. There's going to be a great reckoning. The wickedness of our ways is going to have to be reconciled. There's going to be a hard fork. And either everybody decides we stop this kind of wickedness of our ways, we become good stewards of power, and as such, as good stewards of power, we reinstate the garden or something like that, or we don't, and it goes from purgatory to hell, to an end, because this thing self-terminates. I think those prophecies were pretty straightforward, actually, like pretty straightforwardly accurate. And I do think we are at a time now where until nuclear weapons, that couldn't have been. You couldn't destroy everything that quickly. Obviously, until industrial scale globalization, you couldn't destroy the environment. So we're really, for the first time in the history of the world, at this place where the ongoing viability of the world is up to us. We couldn't have destroyed it before, even when we tried. And so it is true that it is obligate for us to become good stewards of power, because if we continue to steward it the way we have, we'll destroy ourselves. It is also true that some people doing that, not in the presence of other people doing it, lose the game of influence, if not the game of survival, in the very short term to be able to make it through. There's the book of Romans, the path to heaven is narrow and steep, the path to hell is wide and many. There is something like that. There is basically a needle that has to be thread. And that is the hope for this time, is the ability to properly thread the needle of that which will make us good stewards of power, that can also navigate the space of power currently to influence it enough that it on its current trajectory doesn't mess everything up.
Well, I think that, I want to talk a bit more about threading that needle. And in particular, it's become pretty clear to me in my study of what in academia we would call collective action problems, or social traps, which is what Daniel just called the multipolar trap, that situation where, vying geopolitical entities seek power. And that the only way to get around this, like, I actually came to that realization at some level when I took Western political philosophy too, and I was reading Thomas Hobbes, and Hobbes, has that war of all against all. And I think that there's a lot of people in this room who probably are thinking, well, aren't there cooperative forces, not just competitive forces, in human history as well as in evolution? I think that's a really valid argument. Maybe we'll come back to that. But I want to talk about, there's two kind of ways to get around a collective action problem. And one of them is what Hobbes referred to as the Leviathan, which is you get enough power and you impose power and you make it so anyone who would do something that's not good, that's competitive and trying to do the power game, you shut them down. That's way one. And the other way is through cooperation. And that one's really hard. I mean, if anywhere, there's, folks who might have started an eco village or something like that in this call, and even getting just a few people to get along is hard, right? So we might come back to that. But I think that what is really insightful here is that we have to, at some level, through conscience, without ever that, as soon as you start down that road, once you start down the dark path, right, through conscience, we gain influence through conscience. We have to, at some level, push in the same way that Gandhi or others would have. Gandhi had extraordinary influence, but he gained that influence not by being a really terrible player on the world stage, but by acting in a conscientious way, because we're a social species and we respond. We have an immediate response to, a mirror neuron type response. If you are acting a certain way, I feel that in my own self. And so there's a way in which I guess I wanted to talk to that a bit, Daniel. Do you see that sort of path of like uniting conscience with I hate to call it spirit with strategy, but I really, maybe emphasis on the conscience part, and then the strategy part has to be born of that, right? Has to be born from the conscience piece. And then moving from there, do you think that there's a pathway to thread that needle through the force of conscience, through prophetic voice?
When I was a kid, my mom was taking me to a bunch of protests and, various nonprofits, PETA and Greenpeace and like that, engaged in activism work. I remember there was a few NGOs that came together to protest a nuclear waste dump being created. And I got to see how the activists were organizing. And I got to see how the nuclear and financial and legal entities on the other side were organizing a little bit, just watching as a kid. And there was this insight that came. The first level of the insight was the activists are obviously motivated by something that is much less self-interest. They're chaining themselves to things where they get hurt. They're willing to go to jail but their tools of strategy are chaining themselves to things and picket signs and like that. And the tools of strategy on the other side are employing heaps of mathematicians and physicists and chemists and lobbyists and financiers and et cetera. And it's so obvious who's winning and, like who's going to win and why, but also who should, right? That distinction. And I saw it as like a head-heart divide at the level of humanity that had to be unified. And then I looked a little bit later and thought of it as like a head-heart will. Because I could see people where if any two of the three didn't work, right? If someone had a lot of will and a lot of heart, meaning like there was a lot of care about other beings and the willingness to take a lot of action, but they didn't understand strategy well, they were most activists. If they could think about the complexity of the world well and the perverse incentives, the financial motivations, the lobbying on the other side, et cetera, and they cared a lot, but they didn't have a lot of empowerment, they were like kind of broken, devastated liberal academics. If the heart was kind of shut down and they were mostly pursuing self-interest, but they understood strategy and they were pretty empowered with will, they were the people who ran the world and ran big oil companies and finance companies and military industrial companies and things like that. And so it was very clear that those coming together was necessary kind of requisite, right? And it is obvious that the strategy does not actually pick what is valuable. It figures out how to do effective work towards what is valuable that comes from deeper places. And so intellect and strategy in service of conscience is necessary, right? Like there's no conscience that doesn't know how to be very effective is kind of a death with dignity strategy. And, you know, for me, seeing that and being like, if I work my ass off and all the animals are still in the factory farm, I don't feel okay about that. I don't feel some self-relief. I don't feel proud. Like I want to be effective at it. And so a lot of people talk about not caring about the result as much, but the process, because when one overfocuses on results, they can go out of integrity. I care about the relationship between the result and the process both, right? Now, one other thing though is, like, let's say you take a look at Gandhi, which is, you know, as good an exemplar as you could get of this. If you do a realism analysis, right, the kind of political school of realism coming out of realpolitik analysis of nonviolence movements, you get a very different perspective than the story the nonviolence movements tell. And I think it is a more historically and politically accurate one. And it's important to understand if you want to be effective. The realist analysis is Gandhi said that what happened with the British in India could have worked against Hitler. Total gibberish, like complete, obvious, total gibberish. And in the only reason, there were a few, but the reason why at that particular time in India that was able to work is because, as he said early in his career there, 20,000 British soldiers cannot rule 400 million Indians if the 400 million Indians don't consent. They were already getting to the place of the willingness to have enough of their people die to violently kill all of the 20,000 soldiers. There was a violence movement that he was holding at bay with the nonviolence, which is why they didn't kill him. And every nonviolence movement that has been effective against powers that are willing to enact violence has only been effective when it was the better alternative against violence as the alternative. And a very similar thing was that in the assessment that, so like, if they'd killed Gandhi, then the Indians would have started killing British soldiers at scale, right? It's the only reason he didn't get killed. And so it's just important to understand that the reason that the US went ahead and made some provisions with Martin Luther King was because the power Malcolm X and the Black Panthers were getting was scaring the shit out of them. And the idea of move the attention over here to the nonviolence thing was like positive. So the reason I bring this up is because if you want to look at previous precedents of things that were successful to be able to try to do successful work, do your research well enough to say, was it actually successful? And how did it work?
So that's really powerful, Daniel. And I still, you know, sitting here, I have a pretty deep conviction about moving from a place of conscience to shift the world in a better way. And I think that conscience calls us to strategy. I
Yes.
think that if we're really deeply in touch with conscience, we do the strategy because we actually don't want to live in a world where what's happening in factory farms is happening in factory farms. And we want to live in a world which is beautiful and hopeful.
Let me go one step
so,
beyond the three-part will, heart, mind. The chakras are a lovely system, right? If you I don't know if people here are familiar with it, but the yogic system and the Egyptian system, the Chinese system are pretty similar. So whenever there's a bunch of independent origination, it's kind of interesting. But each of them are thought of as different types of intelligence, and that a full human approach is all of them. And so if you, I don't need to go through them here and take the time for it, but if you are to think about we want to engage not with a part of the world, but all of the world, but we want to engage with all of the world with all of ourself, right? And all of ourself means all of our agency and all of our intellect, all of our intuition, all of our instinct, all of those things in service of all the world. So I think there was a talk that I really liked that Eckhart and the Dalai Lama did together one time, where Eckhart was saying something about like in his language, when you access the power of now, you have increased coherence for capabilities at whatever it is that you're going to do. And then somebody in the audience asked something about when you access that, is it like accessing the Akashic records where you can just get anything and do anything? And Eckhart was like, I don't have that experience, because like a great soccer player who gets quiet and goes into a place of stillness comes out and does the free kick better than he would have otherwise. But he's like, if I went to do that, I still wouldn't make the goal, as Eckhart, right? He's like, I don't do that thing well. When Einstein would go into silence, he'd come out with math. But Eckhart was like, I never get math. Like I never get general relativity coming out of there. And he asked the Dalai Lama, he's like, no, I don't ever get general relativity because I didn't take that in. And the same reason that when someone goes deeply into prayer, they usually get answers in languages they speak. They usually don't get them in Sanskrit or Mandarin or some language they don't speak. So there's a place where listening to conscience, it can only tell you things that you have also cultivated your being to understand. So this is where the models of what does it take to be effective, such that you develop those in yourself, such that as you're going into prayer and going into listening, those languages exist within you to be spoken to, is also important.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we've gone really deep, and I think that I can imagine folks in the audience right now being like, "That is a harsh view of human history, or of what we're up against," I suppose, and the strategies that might work, or approaches that might work. And I feel like I want to sort of finish out by sort of entering some of that stillness together, and wondering if there's, in particular, a message to the QEW community, to Quakers, that you feel, you were just mentioning, like Einstein comes out with this. What is the unique role of faith communities in this time? And what does the earnestness look
I don't
like
know
in the
if
picture?
I don't know how many people here saw when this Pope
Yeah.
got put in place and he wrote the Laudato Si encyclical. If you saw it, awesome. If not, it's really worth reading. It's actually very beautiful. And basically what he said was, and I'm grossly paraphrasing, there's been this kind of forever conversation or debate about, is God transcendent beyond the creation or immanent in dwelling within the creation?
Mm-hmm.
I would say that the error in the direction of an overemphasis on transcendent over immanent has caused a lot of problems. Because we can destroy things here in a holy war for going to heaven, or for good reincarnation, or for getting off the wheel, or whatever it is that denies some of the sacredness of here. And if you hold that the creator indwells within its creation, and any harm against creation is sin against the creator, there's a much safer ethics that emerges. So if you take the direction of eminence, and basically what he said in the Laudato Si is the eminence matters, and that if you aren't an environmentalist protecting God's creation, you aren't a Catholic. Now, of course, that was a fucking big deal to say, like, a God created all of this thing, this is all sacred. If you are harming God's creation, you are in sin. That doesn't mean that really changed anything. because like so often would happen in something like Catholicism, it's kind of like easy to moralize people while not actually changing the things that dispose their beliefs and behaviors. And so what I would love to see follow is okay, what would it take then for the Vatican to leverage its resources to say, how do we help people deepen their understanding of nature, their connection to it, and change the perverse incentives that force, environmental harm and things like that? That'd be amazing. I think all the faith communities have beliefs that could be emphasized. Like there are some Christians who focus on the wrath of the Leviticus God and the reasons to kill someone for violating the Sabbath, or who focus on the forgiveness of Jesus and let he who has no sins cast the first stone. You can kind of emphasize different aspects of it. I think most of the faiths have things that, if they were emphasized, would be profoundly relevant to the situation today. And when it comes to Quakers, I don't know. I would need to ask a lot of questions and spend some time, which I'd be very interested in. But just like the starting place is if total global Quakers is a few 100,000, right?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
And so if we were to say that, while that's a small population in one way, it's a lot of people. Like a lot of people that have some shared sense of what is meaningful, sacred, etc., that they're willing to obviously live their lives differently based on, make some sacrifices based on. If they could come to understand the state of the world more rather than just kind of local issues, understand, the Metacrisis, the drivers, and what addressing that would take, and have their life as a group, not just individually, be coordinated in service of helping the world move through this point in history, not to the direction of self-destruction or totalizing dystopias, but in the direction of something like reinstatement of a garden. What would it mean for that to actually become the timely imperative of Quakers as a whole that they could coordinate towards? That'd be very interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think we're almost perfectly on track. I want to kind of transition at the 45-minute mark since our opening worship to bringing in some questions from the audience. And do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So in Humanity's Phase Shift, which is what Keith, the video that a lot of us watched before coming to hear you today, Daniel, you said that reconditioning our felt sense of interconnectedness with everything won't be easy and will require a fundamental shift of our consciousness. And I thought that the three things that you offered as ways to reconnect were humorous. And I wanted to ask how that has changed. But the three things you offered were to be in nature, do psychedelics, and have more intimate relationships with more people. And so how have your modes of reconnection changed in the last 5 years since that conversation, that video?
First, I'll say there's a woman named Vanessa Andreotti. She wrote a beautiful book called Hospicing Modernity that I got to speak with recently. Indigenous woman who's actually leading some amazing educational projects in Canada. We just talked, and she told me that the way that her chief defines colonialism, and I thought this was very beautiful, had nothing to do with taking other people's land or violence or property ownership or whatever, that those were all epiphenomena, that the heart of colonialism is believing there are separable things. And deeper than believing that is perceiving the world as separable things, the pattern of perception cultivated. And that that conditioning of mind, I don't think can avoid creating more separation, more externalities, more rivalry in the process of everything it does. Intrinsic to the nature of how it perceives, and as a result, in how it sense makes and what it does. So, and that's not intrinsic to the nature of mind. It's intrinsic to the way that most modern civilizations have cultivated mind. And so cultivating, and David Bohm and Krishnamurti and so many said something almost identical about what the root of all the problems is. So at the basis, having a perception where you don't see things as separate things that you label in words with a packet of information that is fairly static about what that thing is, you have unmediated contact with reality, not mediated through words and concepts, that increases the depth of your sensing, because your sense making can't be better than your sensing is. And most of the time we're perceiving so shallowly, so little of the total bandwidth of the thing. And then our sense making is almost all based on abstractions. And the abstraction, that the world of our ideas of what a tree is and what everything is not the world, it's a simulation. And so we live in that simulation on the world. So the ability to have much deeper sensing that is not mediated through word and concept, where the interconnectedness of everything is intrinsic and the uniqueness of everything is intrinsic, both. I would say it's only from there, what you're calling conscience internally, in a reality that is where there's no separation. There's no separability. I can say I'm a separate thing, but take plants away and I don't exist. Take the gravitational field away, I don't exist. Take the sun away, I don't exist. So the concept of me as a separable thing is nonsense, because I depend on a lot of things that are outside of the definition of me. In that inseparable nature of reality, listening within and listening without are both kind of the same. I mean, they're both valuable. They have different qualities. So meditating and being still and listening internally in different ways to the sensations in my body, to the emotions, to subtle intuition, is all very important. But really deeply witnessing nature and really deeply witnessing people and listening is just as important. It's another kind of prayer. So I find conscience and spirit distributed everywhere, right? Because there's nothing in which spirit is not indwelling. So that mode of perception, the interconnectedness, the uniqueness of everything, and really being with the instantiated details fully, is the only mode of mind from which strategies about how to make things better are rightly grounded, I feel. How do you cultivate that? I mean, I think we could raise children in a way where that was the default state. We don't, but I think that's a possible thing. For people who have already been conditioned to see everything as separate things and are having to recondition that, yeah, I think time, not just in nature, but in wilderness, particularly if you can get in old growth, right? Where you can, because a young forest does not have the complexity that's been clear cut and regrown with a few species of tree, does not have the complexity of an old growth forest, doesn't have the same thing. If you can get deep into wilderness and spend enough time there and enough silence, a tremendous amount of transformation in your mind and being starts to happen, and a tremendous amount of understanding about things. So I think that's about as good as anything. I think, when I said psychedelics, there are lots of experiences that can induce states that change the nature of perception through fasting, through vision quests, through sweat lodges, through, medicines are one of them. But inducing states in which your perception of reality is experientially very different can help people realize more in a more embodied way how limited their perceptual space usually is. And the thing that I had said then about relationships, yeah, I think really deeply loving more beings really helps. And in really deeply loving them, seeking to understand them and imagine what it's like to be them and realize that you don't know, but really try to feel what it's like to be other beings. Your own ego can't actually imagine what it's like to be other beings because it's its own set of things. So like to really take on what it's like to be them, the part of me that the aspect of me that can do that is not my identity. It's something deeper than identity. And the pattern of putting myself at the center all the time is very transcended in that process. There's a bunch of other things, but that's a few.
So the next question we have is from Hogan Williams.
So I'm someone who's deeply concerned about the sense-making crisis aspect of all of this. Addressing sense-making seems to call for humility, listening, and slow process. Yet addressing existential risk seems to call for boldness, prophetic speech, and action over contemplation. At least that would be one way to slice it. You may deconstruct that. It seems that if we have one without the other, we are likely lost. Yet they seem so different as to be working at cross purposes. Can you speak to this tension between contemplation and boldness, these divergent approaches, and how we might wisely weave them?
Yeah, totally. Everybody's familiar with the Dunning-Kruger curve. This idea in sociology, I'll explain it, that when someone doesn't know anything about a field, they can actually have a lot of unearned confidence in their ideas about the space because they're not aware of how much stuff they don't know. And then as they start to study the field, their confidence drops radically because all the things that were in the unknown for them move into the known unknown. They're like, shit, there's so much stuff I don't know. And so it is common that people who have much less depth of thought have more confidence on a topic, and people who have more confidence understand how complex the thing is. The idea of the Dunning-Kruger curve is you start here, and then as you gain more knowledge, you drop, and then you slowly kind of come back up as you gain expertise. What I find is in trying to not study a specialty where I can eventually know most of the field, I got my PhD in it, whatever, but in trying to study the nature of reality and trying to study how to make a big difference in the world, my sense of how much I know just keeps dropping forever. The more I learn, the more things I'm aware really matter that I don't know continuously. So I don't think you ever end up getting something like a similar type of confidence. I think what you get is a place where you understand a topic well enough to know that your best ideas might not only be wrong, but even harmful. And yet you're pretty clear that your assessment is factoring more things than the other assessments that are currently running the world. And so there's an obligation to start to act, but not with confidence, more with like a sacred obligation that feels, it doesn't feel like egoic empowered agency. Fuck, I got this. I know what to do. I'm going to go solve this thing. I'm going to crusade. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like really fucking scared to fuck stuff up. And really continuously listening. So that's my sense, is that if you are trying to address nuclear risk, or AI risk or whatever, and you proceed confidently, you'll almost certainly make it worse, which is almost always the case. So you want to, if you don't have good sense making about the cause of the issues and how the nature of what you, I mean, classically, it's not just you can optimize for a project and end up externalizing harm elsewhere, which happens all the time. It's things like you create a movement, the movement becomes very effective, but it appeals to some people and actually anti-appeals to other people. So you drive the counter movement. It's called schismogenesis. And so has the like racial justice movement enlightened everybody? No, the anti-woke culture actually emerged as a counter response to the nature of how kind of woke social justice moved forward. And every time the way that reparations were talked about was expressed, it did not do good sense making about how that would appeal to everybody. A lot more people joined the far alt-right and things like that. So if you want to actually make things better, in the Tao Te Ching, it says, the master navigates the world as careful as one walking on black ice. And what I like about that so much is if you're walking on black ice, you don't have to want to split your head open. Just the tiniest lapse of awareness and you can split your head open. And so recognizing that navigating the world is like walking on black ice, especially if you try to do things at scale. But it also doesn't say the master stays at home because there's black ice. He's navigating the world. But it is full, and it's not full of fearfulness, it's full of carefulness, the depth of care. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we've got one last one from the folks who wrote in questions, and then we've got all, I think, six hands raised. So hopefully we can get to everybody. I want to turn finally to Pamela Haynes. Pamela, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I think that some of my question got answered by your response to Mish and Keith's suggestion that you speak to hope in response to everything. I'll just leave that part of it out. So my question is really simple, and it's, what do you love?
I can't answer that very well. Because it is definitely beyond words. I love reality in all of the unique expressions. If you were to ask what motivates my work, like what I'm working for, I'm not working for the end of AI arms races or nuclear races or to get the chemicals out of the ocean or like, I mean, yes, those are specific things, but I close my eyes, I meditate, and I see kids playing in the future. I see them and I see through their eyes. I see them learning to climb a tree for the first time and loving trees. I see them falling in love for the first time. I see them feeling awe at sunsets. I see the mom falling in love with them. I see them learning to commune with animals. And just that gets to continue is what I love and am in service to. All the rest is complicated strategy in service to that. And for the non-human world as much as the human world.
Daniel. Phil?
Daniel, brilliant presentation. I'm a scholar of the relationship between the sciences and the world's religious and spiritual traditions. From that perspective, it struck me as really interesting the pattern or the formal analysis of your presentation, which is you gave us the facts, the situations, the background, You gave us the practices that people engage in, psychedelics, meditation, and so forth. You brought those two right next to each other. Keith and I and many people on this call engage in a kind of reflection right there at that meeting point of the two. You engage in almost no reflection at that particular point. You spoke of actions and facts, wishes, visions, but surely there's a kind of reflection that is right at that intersection. I have the intuition that you'd be able to help us if you sort of open up the doors to that particular room. I'm interested to see how you respond to that invitation.
Yeah, you mean specifically at the intersection of something like the sciences and spirituality?
Right, which is a kind of self-involving intersection. You often answer like a religious studies scholar, which is what my tribe does, and describes externally powerful internal experiences. But there's a kind of internally driven reflection that stems from the motivation or the psychedelic experiences. And you're surprisingly silent at that intersection point.
The when I was growing up, I was homeschooled, and I studied. I had got to make my own curriculum. Didn't have a fixed curriculum, and the kind of braid of topics of interest was all the sciences, all of the kind of spiritual, mystical traditions, and philosophic traditions, and then also the kind of all the domains of activism. And they all felt like the exact same thing to me. I had the same, and particularly because at that time, growing up in the 80s, and what just a fortune of getting exposed to, like, my exposure to science was first Fritjof Capra and David Bohm, and like the whole idea that something at the nature of ecology and complexity science and quantum mechanics would reveal the perennial truths of the spiritual traditions and things like that. So I didn't get science as kind of reductionist atheism first. I got the critique of that first. And there's a paper I wrote, maybe Keith will share it with people, called The Dance of the Tao and the 10,000 Things. And because, the Tao that is nameable is not the eternal Tao. Naming is the beginning of the 10,000 things. Typically, we take it that the engagement with the 10,000 things deadens us to the Tao. But it doesn't have to. It can do the exact opposite, right? It can actually deepen the nature of the appreciation of the Tao. And that's what I meant by the dance between them. And so one of the areas that I really got into was limits of knowability. And whether it was kind of Gödel in mathematics with the incompleteness theorem, or Tarski with the limits of formal logic, or Heisenberg, Bell, on and on. There's these kind of Pearson semiotics. The upper bounds of knowability are ways that logic can transcend itself, because it can identify its formal upper boundaries and then identify how much of reality is outside of it. And then there's the question, well, what is the right epistemology for that then? What is the right way to relate to it? So there's these are some of my favorite topics. There's a lot I could say there. I'm not sure exactly which part of the inquiry is most interesting and alive for you, but it would be a fun conversation.
At some point, I look forward to that. There is a way to speak at precisely that intersection point, which is not just silence. And many of the 100 people on this call are practiced in that. I would love to explore that openness to a form of discourse that was surprisingly silent over the last hour. Thanks again for your talk.
Yeah, well, that's really lovely, Phil. I really love that invitation, and I hope that connection happens. Stan, I got Stan's message, and I don't know if Stan's here, but he wrote it to me in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and just read it out. You mentioned population collapse and Tainter's analysis. 4 or 5 groups of ecologists have estimated that the world can only sustainably support 3 or 4 billion people at a reasonable standard of living, i.e. the European standard. Given we are at 8 billion now, this is not a small problem. Given this, what is your prognosis on collapse or not in the years and decades ahead?
Prognosis on collapse includes population as one factor, but lots of other factors. The topic of carrying capacity is a very tricky topic. It's very tricky for like so many reasons. Carrying capacity meaning how many people can the Earth sustainably support. The answer that comes up most commonly is like 2-3 billion, but the numbers vary from 500,000 to tens of billions, depending upon how people do the analysis. Obviously, before the Industrial Revolution, 500 million, excuse me. Before the Industrial Revolution, the population of the planet was 500 million. And then it went from 500 million to 8 billion almost overnight, right? 200 years with Haber-Bosch and such. But as it did that, as it 16x what had taken over 200,000 years to get in 200 years, it also increased the resource consumption per capita by about 100x in the developed world. So that's obviously a 1600x increase in resource consumption. How you define it, though, is what is the most number of people you can possibly fit on the planet without collapsing the biosphere versus what provides the highest quality of life for all life, including non-humans. Mediated through what kind of technologies gets into deep cultural questions of what a desirable good life looks like. And the enactment pathway of getting there is super tricky because the conversations almost always turn into eugenics and war and like pretty difficult stuff. And if you look at the work of like I'm forgetting his name right now. It'll come to me in a minute. But Elon has talked about this popularly a lot recently, which is that the topic of demographic collapse, that the decreasing birth rates in China in particular, but all around the world, are going to destroy civilization as we know it, not the biosphere, because a smaller percentage of young people entering the workforce, military force, etc., and a lot of old people is not how civilization is designed to function. And that's obviously because we built a civilizational system that is incommensurable with the biosphere. So the ongoing needs that it has for maintenance, like growing GDP and growing population upon which it was predicated, don't work with the biosphere. So is population a topic that we have to figure out? Yes. It's a very tricky one. So I don't like to try to say much definitive about it quickly. When China tried to control its population growth through the one-child policy, or when India tried to control it, some of the unintended side effects were things like over 100 million too many men because they emphasize male children. And now you have literally over 100 million more men than women that can't mate, that are destabilizing civilization. And so like you always have the what is the ideal end state. You have who's ideal, which cultural ethical models, and then you have the enactment to get there. And while there's a bunch of libertarian thought that is gibberish, one of the libertarian questions that is often useful is think about your utopia in the future. Think about all the people that don't want it right now, that would violently resist it because of their different religious ideas or economic interests or whatever, and think about how much violence you would have to enact to force your utopia on them and ask if it's still a utopia. And so the considerations about enactment are very real.
I know Stan pretty well. I'm sure Stan's got a lot to say, particularly on that topic of there's a QEW pamphlet critiquing. He's a demographer, forgetting which college, but critiquing the Elon analysis. So I'm sure he might want to share that with you afterwards. But
I would love to see that analysis. I think it desperately needs critiqued.
Right.
Will do.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
great job on the geopolitical understanding. I'm really impressed with the depth of your knowledge and the realism of your perspective. I've been following Peter Zeihan and many other geopolitical thinkers for many
Diane was
years.
the one I was about to mention who has been popularizing the demographic collapse. So thanks for mentioning it. That was the name I was forgetting.
Yeah. And I'm well aware of the MIT study of they tracked, I forgot, like 6 major measures and how they would change over the next century. I was exposed to this at University of Colorado Boulder while studying geology and economics. And geology is kind of a hotbed of the counter perspective on a lot of these things because we know the paleoclimate very well. We know my professors have been unerringly accurate about predicting how the climate is going to change. Which goes to say, the climate is a lot bigger problem. It's going to cause big migrations all over the place. It's going to change the rules all over the place. The scientific community is just not up to the task of conveying news of that magnitude, especially when the rate of change is faster than a peer-reviewed process will allow. So if you passed over the peer review process about 5 years ago, my question, though, has to do with the longevity and retirement aspects, because we live a lot longer. And I remember a discussion at the University of Colorado 42 years ago where they talk about how that would fragment our society. And it kind of creates this dynamic to say the emphasis is really going to be on the government to take charge and clear a path for the future. There's kind of limits to what you can do as far as social involvement. Could you speak to that?
How we economically support an increasing elderly population? Is that the main question?
Well, it's that there's genetically engineered pig organs that stands to increase life expectancy another decade or two. Stem cell inserts. There's all this technology to say we're going to live increasingly into our hundreds. Roughly some 80% of the federal budget is now devoted to retirement in some way or another, saving for retirement or retirement itself. And so you're kind of say, if we're going to have a massive social movement to change society, you're at some point going to run head on into the cost of retirement, the fact that we live longer.
Yeah. Just having a conversation right before this, the colleague about the collapsing pensions. And again, realist analysis, everybody who studies this knows that the growing debt to GDP ratio is not, there's no path to fix it. And the growing not just debt, but deficit spending, also hitting diminishing returns on so many areas of industry because of planetary boundaries coming up, climate change and others, means the imminent break of the economic system as we know it. When you mentioned climate and the climate predictions, obviously you look at like Jim Hansen recently said 10 Celsius is now the most likely scenario. And you look at the fact that the climate sensitivity numbers in some of the best models have went way up and are like actually being intentionally underreported because not wanting to sound alarmist. But even the UN predictions are 1 billion climate refugees in the next 10 years. And when you look at where they come from, if you look at the Himalayan watershed and India with over 1 billion people, China with over 1 billion people, and Pakistan, and then the Islamic world backing it with over 1 billion people on a dwindling water supply, where a lot of those 100 million person plus climate migrations will occur, all of which are nuclear equipped with massive geopolitical tensions. It's not just like some people die from that. It's like a disruption of the entire world system. So I think that we don't continue to see business as usual into the decade ahead, in retirement is a part of that.
Yeah, I would just add, North America has a radically different fate than Asia. In North America, we don't have these existential problems, and we've got oceans to protect us. I mean, there's a limited amount of threat you can convey over an ocean.
So I want to jump in. I just want to make sure that we have some time for, in particular, I noticed we've had an all men audience or question asking for so far. So I know we have 2 men and 2 women left, and I want to give precedence to Jenny and Shelley. So Jenny, if you would like to ask your question now, and then we can spin back around.
It's not particularly a woman's question, but nevertheless, I wanted to try to bring us back to the question that I'm actually finding it very difficult to articulate, so please forgive me. The question of love at the root of our response to this crisis. And so a couple of things. One is that I think that what you were saying earlier, Daniel, about one of the primary things that's gone wrong, and I'm a scientist and I've been trying to deal with the integration of science and spirituality and technology and economics and the whole thing for many, many years. So trying to see the roots of these things leads you to a place where you're faced with uncertainty and radical humility. So let's start there. But the sense of separation, to me, is allied to a corresponding faith in justifying our actions, which I can't really explain that at the moment, but we have a moral ground for our being that coexists with our egotistical power sense and our ability to justify what we're doing in terms of violence and so on. So I wanted to ask you about how you see love as a guiding principle for how we can act in this complex world that we're now living in. Because when we talk about our faith tradition as Quakers, we're often looking towards our conscience, our spirit, and that spirit is also the ground of love for life, truth, the truth of our unity, and that which guides us into doing action, whether or not we really can be certain of the outcome. Does that make some sort of sense?
Yeah, totally. I don't think we can ever be certain of the outcome.
Right.
I don't think that we shouldn't try to engage in you just went away to look at you while you were talking. I guess not. So
no, I'm here.
There you are. Okay. I think that consequentialist ethics have a role where you think through what will provide the greatest good for the greatest many, and you try to think through the causal dynamics of it. But consequentialist ethics on their own ends up generally making people evil, because you pretend that you have more certainty about the future state than you possibly can. You identify certain bad things that are inevitable, which justifies why you have to do some other bad things because they're less bad. And so the basis of that is actually the excessive certainty that isn't epistemically warranted, which is why the epistemic humility is so important. So there's a kind of virtue ethic, which is, I don't know how the future is going to unfold. There's unpredictable complexity everywhere. But I know that the choices that have the most integrity in the moment put out the kind of ripples that will ripple well, right? So that's kind of a virtue ethic. There's kind of a utilitarian ethic that tries to think through what is a viable end state here? What is a viable or at least new homeodynamic state? And can I reverse engineer steps? They're both important.
Right.
And then there's something that is kind of deeper than either of those, even deeper than the virtue ethic, which is something like the feeling guidance that comes from deep enough prayer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And again, that's all the aspects of self
Mm-hmm.
being involved. As far as love at the basis, I think if anyone really explores why they are motivated to do something, it's not purely a rational thing, because a purely
Mhm.
rational thing doesn't actually have motive. It doesn't care, right? Like there is some basis for care. Otherwise, it'd be like, well, if this doesn't happen, then this thing will be harmed. But if I don't care about that thing being harmed, who cares? Right? So like
Mm-hmm.
in a purely rationalist ontology, then I'd be nihilistic. So I want to change this because this is horrifying, because I'm fucking pissed that they're doing this, because I'm heartbroken over here. Well, but any of those emotions, I'm heartbroken because there is these kids' lives in Gaza, these animals in the factory farm are beautiful. They're sacred, which is why I care. So underneath the heartbreak and underneath the anger and underneath the depression, the devastation, underneath all of the sense of injustice is actually love. Because if I didn't find some reality beautiful that I loved, there would be no basis for the other emotions.
Right.
So the idea that all of the other emotions are actually responses to love, to care, then you recognize the anger, the sadness, the depression, the anxiety are all actually sacred. They all have a place, but they're not at the source. So you embrace them and then you trace them back to where they come from.
Mm-hmm.
When you trace them back to where they come from, rather than being angry at who the bad guy is, what I love becomes clear. And then that is actually an even deeper motive. And then how do I be effective in service of what I love is a clearer focus. So it's just the deep reflection on what the motivation is and tracing it back to the source.
Right. And I agree. And I think it's also that, you know, love is one of the most misunderstood words and most misunderstood concepts. It's overused and underused all the time. But it's also, to me, the great attractor, what I call the great attractor. So it actually applies to science as well. There's not a place where love doesn't exist in this whole concept, you know, and it can be the root of guiding very, very practical action. It doesn't have to be something that, oh, this is just a feeling state, or this is just the way Quakers talk, or something like that. It's actually the concept of total unity. It's a unified consciousness, if you like.
Yes.
So.
Reminds me of the harmony of the spheres. And, you know, Daniel has a beautiful talk on emergence that if you want to look that up on YouTube at some point, Daniel talks about something very similar to what you just said, Jenny. But Shelley, I would like to invite you to ask your question.
Thank you, and appreciate the opportunity. Daniel, I really, I learned from, I want to take us back to some of the things you said at the beginning of your analysis of the different factors. You mentioned 3 different factors that motivate individuals and society to determine whether we're effective or not. And as I understood it, one of them was understanding how the world works, and the second has to do with your ethics, or whether you care about the global world or not. And third was an effective strategy to take action. And if I'm not sure I got all that right, but if that's correct, I find that most of the people, if not all of them on these screens, are pretty well versed in the first one, how messed up our world is, and the second one, all deeply caring and wanting to make the world a better place. So going beyond their own personal satisfaction and needs to wanting to create a better world. But where we almost all of us fail is we don't know what to do about it. We don't have an effective strategy. And I think you've kind of answered with your answer to Jenny, but I wonder if you could reiterate it in another way so we all understand what are the best strategies for us to figure out what is an effective strategy, and not just individually, but how can we collectively as a Quaker community take action?
Is this being posted on the internet?
That was the intention, but if you want to cut anything, I don't know where you're gonna go, but we can totally work out whatever feels good there.
Okay. In a different setting, I could say more about this. I'll say a couple things. The study of effective strategy is different in kind than studying like environmentalism and the fact that the environment's messed up. Because you're studying how power works. And you're studying it not just to critique it, but to engage in it. And so that is a very different kind of study. It looks at how is it that corporations are able to lobby governments and put corporate agents into regulatory positions to regulate the government in their interests and things like that. And all those critiques of the rotating, revolving doors of somebody from big ag or big pharma then running the FDA and, or the public-private partnership where the private side writes the law that the public side implements, or the massive subsidies to fairly toxic things that happen because the big companies that have the patents have the money to pay a lot more lobbyists than the things that are inherently decentralized, like regenerative versus conventional agriculture, whatever. There's the way the critical theorist studies this, which is basically to just say it's really bad. Like, look at all this bad stuff. It's really bad. There is the way that one studies it from the perspective of how does influence at scale operate? What are the various modalities that when the world has changed, who changed it, and what were the tools they used to change it? And if someone does not feel good about using those tools, they counter as they have to say, do I feel good about letting those who are using the tools currently continue to do it for those goals? So being able to lobby a government for subsidies that ends up affecting market dynamics profoundly is something that big corporations are good at and that nonprofit groups are not good at. Nonprofit groups don't study how finance works and how lobbying works and those types of things well. Being able to figure out how to write a very complex multi-100-page operating agreement for a public-private partnership that has all the fine print to do everything you want, where many different government jurisdictional bodies are now doing your will, is something that the financial sector and various large corporate sectors are very good at, and people trying to do good things are not good at. And so if you want effective strategy, you have to study effective strategy. And so let's say, for instance, I'll give a historical example. And it's a fake example, but you'll get a sense. Let's say that we had a chance to talk to the Tibetans before Mao invaded. Let's say we had a chance to talk to them a couple decades before. They were not studying effective strategy because that was not their jam. That was not what their culture was about, right? They were doing different things and they were doing lovely things. They obviously did not study that. And the results are also quite obvious. Now, if they were to think about geopolitical strategy for a minute, it would be pretty easy to say, oh, there are 2 billion person populations on either side of a watershed, and we are at the source of the watershed. I bet we don't get to stay here. Like, it seems pretty obvious that we don't get to stay here. One of these sides is going to take the top of the watershed. Also, this is going to be key to the strategic communications and missile defense. So geographically, the fate is already written that we don't get to stay here. Given that, what should we do? And either they would have done something like anticipatorily create a partnership with one of the sides in which they had something unique to offer, they would have left, or they would have done something like Finland did between the USSR and EU to be in a buffer zone relationship where both sides militarily protected them because of that, or like Switzerland did to say, you know, all of the international agreements between the two of you we're going to be able to host. And so let's say that Tibet had realized that 30 years before the kind of rise of Mao, and they had went to the European powers at the time and said, look, here's what's going to happen. China's going to get this otherwise, and it's going to help their rise to power that is going to end up threatening you and blah, blah, blah. And here's why you want to help protect us, like offer kind of military legal support protecting us here. And then here's what we're going to tell India. Here's what we're going to tell China, such that in the same way that nobody invaded Switzerland because everybody was invested in being able to store their gold and stuff in Switzerland because Switzerland was thinking about strategy, then Tibet could have done that. This would not arisen from the minds of the Tibetan people with the culture they had. It did arise from the minds of some religions like Jews, right? They had a different type of spirituality and mind arising that thought about strategy in a different way. So it's not that there aren't places like Tibet that had the same geographical determination that did a better job than they did. It's that it required a different type of mind. And that, as I've mentioned, the people who are good at strategy are almost always, strategy is a military term. It then gets applied to business and other things, but it is about effective achieving of goals, which are almost always narrow goals where you externalize costs in the process and against adversaries, right? Like that's, so the mind that gets good at strategy is almost always co-occurring with something that is self-centered, either at the level of the individual, the nation state, the corporation, but not the commons and all life in perpetuity. When you're thinking about the commons and all life in perpetuity, you're not thinking, how do I win stuff? And so, but it's kind of like, let's take Star Wars. Let's say there were no Sith, right? There wouldn't have to be Jedi if there were no Sith. Everybody could just be farmers and poets and parents and teachers, and it would be lovely. But if there are Sith, there must be Jedi. And the Jedi are not trained in farming. They are trained in warfare. Protective warfare, right? Not in service of empire and conquest, purely like the white blood cells in the immune system. And so what I would say is, if you want to be effective at serving things that you care about in the presence of other groups that are effective at serving the goals they care about, you need to engage in that field of study.
Could you repeat that last sentence?
Yeah.
What was that?
It's almost as if what you're saying is that in order to be effective, we need to let go of our ethics, because in order to be effective, the way you're most effective is by being self-serving and, you know, with a narrow focus. So that's a real problem.
I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm saying that it is unethical to do something that you know is for sure ineffective. To let horror and tragedy and species extinction continue because you aren't willing to engage in effective strategies unethical. We are responsible not just for what we do, but what we don't do. And so there is an ethical responsibility to effectiveness. That doesn't mean you justify any amount of harm in the process. I'm not, and that's the tricky thing, is that the cultures that said, okay, we don't want wiped out, therefore we have to build a standing military or whatever, we're not the same culture anymore, because they had to reinvest things that had went into arts and child education and whatever, now into military and those types of things. So the two fail modes that we have to avoid is a culture that is doing something that is more ethical in its goals, that just gets destroyed by a more dominant culture. That's a fail mode. Or even if it doesn't get destroyed because no one cares about it because it has no power, but it fails to prevent harm in the rest of the world happening. That's a fail mode. And the other fail mode is that in the aim of not being destroyed and being effective, it also becomes a dominator culture. That's also a fail mode. So you can neither be destroyed by the machine or become the machine is the answer. So you have to do something that is neither of those. So in learning how to be effective, obviously the long-term play there is a change of all of the systems that mediate game theory itself. The consciousness and the systems, which will look like not capitalism, not nation states, and not minds that see everything as separate things. But we don't get there if right now everybody that is effectively getting lawmakers to write law are doing it in narrow, short-term private interests. I would rather environmentalists know how to do the corporate thing as well as the corporate guys do for a different set of purposes. Well, of course, I would like to have a government that is not hijackable by anybody's interests and that has a good collective intelligence guiding it. We obviously don't have that. So having the more inclusive goals be effective in the current dynamics while seeking to upgrade the underlying systemic dynamics, both have to happen simultaneously. It's a tall order.
Yeah. Well, thank you for
Now,
sharing
being
that.
effective at a local level is different because you don't have great power vested interest in the same way. And that's awesome. And I encourage most people to actually feel really good about that as opposed to hopeless about the scale that it's not operating at. And for those who can't not think about the world at scale and can't not endeavor to become more effective at it, it's just a different study.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for sharing that. And yeah, I think that a core tenet of Quakerism is about peace, right? I'm guessing you might have ran across that. From the 1650s onward is this sort of testimony on peace, and so there's much more to endeavor into there, but and into that.
So let me give you, for
language
instance.
Yeah.
So the nuclear clock got moved closer to midnight, associated with the escalation in Ukraine.
Yeah.
You have not heard a good thought on a plausible end game when you watch the news, because there is not one. There is on one side a bunch of rhetoric, like Putin is Hitler, and if he takes part of Ukraine, then bad guys everywhere will start taking other places and he'll take all of Europe and whatever, and this is why we have to. But there's no thought about okay, so we're closing possible de-escalation pathways. What is the end game that we're going towards instead? And engaging with this pretty directly, I can tell you that there's very wacky conversations about our first strike nuclear dominance and stuff like that. So if you are focused on peace, it's not just we don't want to wage war, it's that we want to be effective at de-escalating everyone who is waging war, and there are increasingly hawkish people on all sides.
Absolutely.
So learn how to be effective at influencing what is happening at the level of national security councils.
Yeah.
To be able to have the more de-escalatory voices get into more positions of power and the escalatory hawkish voices not be there. So it takes a particular, but unless you know how to talk to security councils in a language that will move them, then you don't have the ability to help de-escalation in those ways, or the other forces that you'd need to work with. So I think one time when I was like 9 years old, I had an experience probably many people here have had where I was horrified at my inability to not cause harm. That I I couldn't avoid when I was walking on the grass, maybe killing some bugs. I couldn't, at least my 9-year-old mind, the mites that were destroyed with my breath and my eyelash flutters, was just like so kind of horrifying. So I was like, just stood there frozen, didn't want to move, wanted to breathe the littlest possible. And okay, I realized I have to breathe and move, but really tried to think about how do I not cause any harm? And I'm complicit with all these systems that are fundamentally ecocidal and genocidal to be able to just get my stuff, right? And even if I'm eating a vegetarian diet, but the shipping processes, the oil that was involved in shipping it, everything, right? There's blood in all of that stuff. And so I'm like, okay, so I have to only have things I make myself from stuff that I find. And the idea that then for me to have my hands clean, I'm not causing harm, also means I am totally complicit in allowing all the harm of the system to happen because I'm not willing to interact with any of it. There's a kind of humility that says, no, I'm going to drive a car with fossil fuels that not only are destroying the environment, but create wars that kill children, that I am partly driving the demand for. Then there is a place where like I don't get to have my hands clean in this world. I do my very best, but there's a humility in that that's important. There's a realism in it that's important. There's a not superiority over everybody else, just being like, we're in this thing together at this time. This is the time that we're in. And then say, like, if I'm a pacifist, I'm not the one who controls the nuclear buttons. I'm not the one who controls the rapid proliferation of drone weapons. If I'm really a pacifist, meaning I don't want there to be killing anywhere, how do I become increasingly influential over the people who are in control of the nuclear buttons and who are building all of the AI-empowered drone weapons? But that means maybe I have to learn how to engage compellingly with places that I would rather never engage with.
Well, we've got 2 more questions, and I want to kind of finish out with those. I think we'll finish here at 6 o'clock Pacific, 9 o'clock Eastern. So David, I want to give you an opportunity, and then Eric, and then Daniel, any closing words?
Greetings, Daniel and everyone from Wajak Noongar Budja in Western Australia, where it's now 8:53 a.m. Saturday morning. And it does make me think of Edward Wilson's classic line, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and God-like technology. So I did enjoy your talk very much, Daniel, and I love that you refer to sort of evolution, or at least cultural evolution. And I have great respect for the United States of America, 2 years away from your Declaration of Independence, and essentially founding a republic. So it's pretty amazing for me living in what is a fairly robust democracy here. But I do doff my cap at America's abilities. So in terms of evolutionary perspectives, I mean, I remember in the early 90s, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, one of the classic lines was, because we went from 2 superpowers to the 1 superpower, and one of the classic lines was, the new world superpower is global public opinion. And now it's a little bit more mixed up, but I'm just wondering overall what you think of the prospects of democracy, modern representative democracy, which of course is nothing like ancient Greek democracy.
Not good. You just went away again. Why do people go away right after they talk?
I'll go ahead and pin David.
I'm here. I'm still here.
All right. So it's a long, complicated answer, but when the US democracy was founded, we did have an ocean separating us. And so the idea that there were a few things, but one, the idea that the people could know everything so they could be democratically, participatory, Once we started to get the telegraph and then kind of mass telecommunications and then satellite spying, SIG-Intel, and hypersonic missiles, anything the American public know, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians instantly know. That means you started having a situation where almost everything became a national security secret and could not be shared with the public or even Congress mostly. Because where the fertilizer is stored is a weapons knowledge, where the aquifers are, so increasingly, the most critical information can never be known by the public because it's national security secrets. You can't run a democracy where you have to classify everything. And yet you also can't have a world that is in that kind of warfare where you share all of the things that are national security secrets with the public. That's one example of a context change in which the ideas that kind of made sense just totally don't make sense. The thing that we called a democracy obviously did all of its labor with slavery, and which means that all the shit jobs that people had no vote in. And then we kind of got rid of that. Obviously, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we didn't really get rid of slavery. We just got a peonage slavery system where we put people in jail for false reasons and then, forced labor out of them. We really only got rid of it when globalization allowed us to ship the slavery overseas and buy the stuff back ineffectively. And, so if you were to say, can a democracy make the decisions where the totality of the decisions of everyone that it's affecting all have a voice, all the stakeholders have a voice? That's never happened, right? So a country will look at its Gini coefficient and say what the inequality is, but it buys its stuff from a country where almost everybody is poor. In which case it depends upon, so the only level at which Gini coefficient makes sense is global, right? There's so many things like that where you really have to think about that which you depend upon and are driving the supply and demand of. So if you really look at, did we ever have democracy? There was actually a thing where the stakeholders that were being affected really had any say. It's not a very good analysis. And then when you say, does the thing that we have now even resemble the elements of that? Totally not. Now, how do you deal with that moving forward? There is no system of governance in the history of the world that can deal with the issues that we need to deal with now. Because, for instance, gene synthesizers are becoming cheaper on an exponential curve. And it is already the case that quite inexpensively, you can get the ability for gene synthesis and amplification. And it's a couple years at the current rate away from incredibly cheap, like desktop capability for everybody. So if you even have open publishing of science, where the science is doing gain of function research to look at incredibly virulent pathogens and you publish the genome sequence, the information file alone, which is now open published on the internet, is enough to make catastrophe weapons. And you can't monitor and control that the way you can nukes, because nukes obviously are very, very hard to make, and you can see the facilities, the uranium enrichment, et cetera, from space. But we're talking about devices anybody can have in a tiny basement lab. And so that either means you just stop science, mostly, because it's all Pandora's boxes, or you stop open publishing, totally in the Popper idea of kind of democracy there, because the knowledge itself has weaponizable applications of that scale, or you get increasing truly global catastrophes, or you create a massive surveillance state. Those all are bad. There are better answers, but they're not obvious. They require innovation in totally new types of governance of lots of things. So, those are things we work on, but I don't think that there are any systems of governance known to date that can deal with these kinds of issues.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much here. I'm going to unspotlight folks real quick. And, we're coming in right here on the end of our conversation. I know Eric I know well, has a question raised. If it's quick, Eric, if you still want to ask it, go ahead and ask, and then Daniel can share some closing thoughts.
So, in fact, Shelley asked a very similar question to what I was going to ask. And I do want to thank you for your answers to the questions afterwards, because their monologues seem to have been basically a list. And it includes numbers like, the however many people the Mongols killed and how much money is being put into AI, which are nice to know, but I think you could assume that the people in this audience have been working on the basic questions for a long time. So my hypothetical question is, suppose we all knew everything that you had to say except for those little numbers. What would you say instead?
It's always hard to talk to an audience that you don't know what is shared knowledge, what's shared worldview. It's always a tricky thing. So my ideal situation is to get to understand what a group is working on, like what the shared knowledge is and what they're already working on together, and what things would be useful or empowering for them. What are the things that they're working on? And then see, do I know anything that would be useful? Maybe I don't. It could be things about pathways of enacting solutions, like specific strategies for enactment. Could be things about prioritization of amongst all the problematic things, which ones make sense to sequence attention on. It could be deepening the understanding of the problem assessment in terms of the causal dynamics more, such that clearer insight about what the effective kinds of strategies would be. But it would depend upon what was already known and what wasn't, and what was interesting.
Well, Daniel, we might need to talk more at some point, but I just want to give you a chance. It's 9:04 your time, I know, but do you want to share some closing thoughts with the group here?
I was I didn't know who was in the group beforehand. When you invited me here, I was happy to see how many people were scientists and were people who've been working on these issues for a long time, knew a lot about it. That's not the case of faith communities in general. So I think that's awesome. If there was a follow-up of, okay, let's kind of share what our state of the world assessment is and what our current thoughts for what we care to do and how we think about how to enact that are, and be able to engage there, that would be really interesting. And if there are people who are have backgrounds in things and are working on things that feel like there are interesting follow-ups we might engage in, if Keith, maybe you send me a list of that would also be really cool.
Definitely will do.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can end with some stillness and getting back in touch with that sacred center. And thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing your thoughts.
But I would like to hear the harvest from this.
Yeah.
So if some of you stay and continue to talk, Keith, if you would share harvest, and there are interesting follow-ups to the intersection of a kind of spirituality that is not incommensurable with any other worldview or religion, that has sacredness, listening, conscience at the center, that also has environmentally interested people and scientists. This is really delightful. I'm really happy to have met the people here, and so I look forward to hearing more.
Thanks, you.
All right. So for folks who are staying, I want to just share with you all the queries that we have. This is not like, I think anytime with queries, it's really where's spirit drawing us? But the questions I've written ahead of time are, how might QEW as an organization respond with deep earnestness to the crisis we face today? Given Daniel's talk, what new insights or challenges are we seeing? And 3, how might our Quaker faith inspire us in taking on our civilizational rite of passage? So I'll drop those in the chat, and then I just want to invite folks to start raising their hands, and maybe once 5 hands are up. So I'll drop those in the chat, and then as folks are led, just raise your hands and we can begin this discussion. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll note, as someone who really loves Daniel's analysis, that I'm like a little nervous because he does lay it on pretty heavy sometimes, but I think it's really important for us to actually, as people who are called to spirituality, not to avoid those facts, but to really face up to them and ask us how conscience would have us respond. So with that, just waiting for hands. We got 4 hands and yeah, 5. Okay, or 4. But anyways, Thor, if you want to go ahead and start us off.
Yeah, I can only speak to number 2 because I'm Lutheran, and I have a very different, well, let's just say we do things a little differently. Same general idea: love your neighbor, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. The thought that occurred to me is, as having deep roots in the scientific community, going back over 50 years, I'm feel motivated to say, how can we kind of merge these points of views? And for example, in the geologic view, there's the oceanographers, there's the astrophysicist, there's the geochemists, there's the paleoclimatologist. There's all these sub branches all the way going down to high temperature superconductors, because that's part of the same physics. And so we know we're very good at working with other groups and seeing things from their point of view because they're all valid. And together you kind of get a broader, more deeper perspective. Because I heard very solid analysis from Daniel on geopolitics and the reality of certain government interactions and, history. But there's a climate aspect that is not well socialized. There are demographic aspects that are not well socialized. My wife is from Taiwan, and having that kind of personal connection, you notice things they don't publish because they're right there in front of you on the ground. And I'm just wondering, where would it be best to kind of fuse those perspectives into a greater one? Because I really firmly believe if you're going to make wise, powerful decisions, you got to know what you face.
Okay, Ronnie, I think everyone can see this list, and if we, yeah, Sue Ellen, we'll try to. I see your hand raised. Don't worry, Ronnie, you want to respond or share?
I do. I mean, I pushed back at the end because not everybody here is a scientist, and I sure as hell don't want to be in a group with just scientists. There's people like me who are more social scientists and a strategist for community organizing and all of that kind of thing. And so, one of the things that I find is, I don't think we have some of the answers we truly need, and yet I also bring a strong Native American orientation to this. And, we can do this from a, whatever this is. I mean, Native peoples have been, destroyed for centuries and whatnot. So it's nothing new. I think, it just to put that into a perspective. And I think it's, I was fascinated with the elder discussion because that's an area where I have a large expertise and cooperative structures. That we're a bunch of older people in this country, and we could start to plan and organize around how we're going to take care of ourselves so that burden isn't on the younger generation. We did talk about there being guidance from younger people, and some of the younger people are starting to organize for what do we do after things break down. So, I don't think we're going to come to terms with it scientifically, and I sure don't think we're going to come to terms with it if we do a whole bunch of philosophizing. I think we've got to hit the ground with our boots on, whatever that is.
I just want to invite folks who have their hand raised, just speak in order that your hands are raised. Yeah. So that's Jenny Ratcliffe right now.
I just want to mention a couple of things, and because I spoke earlier, I'll be quick. That there are several examples I can think of given that you're number 2 and number 3, Keith. I look to people like E.F. Schumacher, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and others that some of us are already familiar with, as to how we can actually build a bridge between the spiritual root and this transformation that we're trying to bring about at the deepest possible level, and turn that into practical action. And when Gandhi made the Sarvodaya movement in India, I think as much as the Satyagraha movement, where which he's known for about peacemaking and Indian liberation from the British and so on, his practical program of appropriate technology, deep economy, deep ecology, in effect. Thomas Berry spoke to this, and we're trying to integrate those things in our own lives, I think. I mean, Daniel sort of painted a picture where, in a sense, we're faced with a dilemma. Do we have to enter the corporate world in order to be able to understand how to fix it? Do we do this, or are we compromising our purity of our intentions if we understand how the armaments industry works, or something like that? And if the criteria is to be effective, but the criteria it has to be effective from in a spiritually guided and transformative way, and that's the challenge we're facing. And I think that people like Schumacher, Gandhi, and others actually gave us practical examples of how we can do this on the ground, real practical stuff. And also what you were saying, Rainey, is it about integrating indigenous knowledge? We're trying to do that as well, to bring out not just the sort of way that we might be able to adapt to the doom that we're already facing, but to make the transformation ahead of time so we minimize the amount of chaos that we're producing.
And I think, yeah, that really resonates with me, Jenny, that the root of it is actually conscience, it's spirit, and conscience leads us to act. So I just want to share that, and that the potency of that, cultivating the potency of that, is, I think, what I'm calling prophetic voice. But Nancy.
Thank you. I was really, really grateful, Keith, that you brought Daniel here and began a dialogue with him that I think we'll circle back into. I have heard him a number of times before, so much of what he had to say was not as hard to hear in a way as it was the first time. And there's a certain relief in the speaking of that and then engaging with it. In his models emphasizing strategy, he omits another way of thinking that can bring together the guidance of spirit, which is particularly central in clarity, being clear about our goals, and them being the right kinds of goals, some of which can be put into words, some of which is a response of the moment of the kind Jenny is talking about and he spoke of, where spirit takes you over. What I'm interested in, the complementarity that is comparable to strategy, is the notion of design, of social design, where science, all the sciences, both the physical, the biological, the social sciences, each have a contribution to naming the givens. The art of design is comprehending the givens in combination with the aspirations of the heart led by spirit. And among the givens, understanding the realities of the situation you're in and the path dependencies and so forth. And then with a collective effort of mutual creativity gained by really hearing each other, to then begin to lay out what are the system requirements and what are the places in the system of leverage points where the changes of the right kind could shift the outcomes. And at those points, what are what I would call at that point design specs for solutions. And looking at stories, it's important to understand the stories of failure. It is equally important to understand the stories of success. I would say to him, look at the open government movement in Taiwan. Talk about an adjacent possible that just suddenly exploded. Nobody could have guessed. Not only a different way of governing at scale, a truly participatory governance at scale, but a different strategy for a different kind of revolution that would occur. Look at the REAMP project in the US and the notion of collective impact and Stanford's social design and so forth. Let us look for those places where there are not only the accidents of the right person at the right place at the right time that history yields, but those things that are replicable, that suggest these are ways of being together, ways of meeting our needs that, as I have put it, to meet the needs of all by healing, not harming planet or people, our material needs. Where are there examples of that? And then where are the examples of, as in the REAMP project, bringing all the elements of a system that was resulting in horrific pollution in the American Midwest, each of them as human beings to come together and jointly map the systems that they were in, coming to know each other as human beings and the roles of each, and then together saying, if we change these leverage points in this system, we could dramatically change. We could reverse. Instead of being the most polluting part of the country, we could become the model of the opposite. As you know, Keith, they were stunningly successful. They stopped the production, the going online of 30 power plants. So I want us to study closely where those things do come together and the ways in which deep listening and love towards each other opens up creativity that is otherwise, again, the adjacent possible. We don't even yet know what it could look like. And lastly, the situation we confront, we're all part of the problem and potentially all part of the solution, is radically different than confrontational, one issue, even if the issue is colonialism, one issue, one shot warfare. This is a really different opportunity in human history.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing that. And I couldn't agree more. And I do think that first example about Taiwan is actually something I've talked directly to Daniel about before. So it's something on his radar. Brad.
I apologize. Zoom has decided again that you shouldn't see me except in a picture. So I'm going to leave the picture there. A couple of things struck me in terms of what he was saying. I was struck by when he grabbed me when he said one of our alternatives is to die with dignity, and I'm working out of that. One of the things that and then he gave a model. I mean, he gave a lot of examples, but one of the examples he gave that I thought was quite moving was he said about Tibet and how Tibet could have anticipated, but they culturally weren't set to it, but they could have anticipated by their geographic placement that they were between two major powers and that they were vulnerable, and done something about it. And interestingly, what he said is they could have gone to Europe and asked for essentially military support, it sounded like, or some kind. What I've noticed is, is a lack on certain of many of us on not wanting to push back. And what I was hearing him say was, you need to study the opponents, so to speak, and you need to understand them in order to know how to resist them in a way that's going to actually be effective. And what he said was, if not being effective is immoral. And I thought that was extraordinary to say. It always struck me that Obama had told us in his books he was a compromiser. And when you have him come into a situation where, for a while, his party controlled all three parts of government, the executive in both houses, and they didn't just do what the Republicans would have done, which is roll over everything. They could have just put in, changed Medicare and had universal health, and 2 years of it before, and then try to take it away. They could have, when they were doing the so-called bailout, they could have bought out everybody's mortgages, taken over the banks. They had the rules to take over the banks and control them, and they didn't do that. They chose to give the money to the CEOs to be able to retire. And we all kind of, okay, that's okay. And part of what really has been bothering me, I grew up in a union house. I grew up, dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, and is that the fear to be called liberal, even. It's like, oh, you're a liberal. Oh my God, and running away from it. And what I'm hearing here is we need to resist. We need to be more active. It doesn't necessarily mean for Quakers to take up arms, but it does mean to fight. And there are ways to fight without taking up arms and shooting people, but it doesn't mean rolling over. It doesn't mean dying with dignity. It doesn't mean letting it happen. And that's what I feel I'm surrounded with too often in the so-called liberal world, is that kind of, well, let's get along, let's not make waves, let's compromise, let's find a way out, and instead of saying, no, this is wrong, we're going to stand up and resist. And I remember peace teams one time had a picture of a girl, this is before the current situation, of a girl standing in front of a tank in Palestine and trying to protect a house, and the tank ran over her and the house. And the line was that they posted was, people are willing to die for war. How many people are willing to die for peace? And it's at that level that we're talking about. And I just feel like that's what he was asking of us in between the lines, is to have that kind of same level of energy and commitment to really push back effectively. Thanks.
Brad, I just want to say you're speaking to my condition. I really, really appreciate that. And I'm not going to dominate this conversation, but I want to invite Roy in. Yeah.
I do want to, I believe what Brad was just saying there, but I do want to at least point out that there was an underlying fear that really wasn't being talked about, that Daniel has, of where we are. And I think that it's important that we understand that fear as we move forward, that it's not an excuse for not moving forward, but that it's an important thing to understand perhaps that the time frame that is available to make the changes that are required is no longer with us. And how do we respond to that? The fear of where we are with AI, the fear we are with how much information needs to be controlled, cannot be talked about, that he was afraid that he would be recorded and that that might be extended to the rest of the world, that he might misspeak. And he was afraid of that. So I think that we need to understand his fears, and we need to understand, should we hold on to those same fears? Or is that something that we have something special within our approach that can work past those fears? He is speaking to the fact that we need to completely change the institutions, the systemic approaches that are already in place all need to be changed, and they all need to be changed simultaneously, and that there's nothing to be left behind. That's revolution. And are we willing to step out to the levels of what does that mean? And what does that mean within a nonviolent approach? And what does that mean to our families and our neighbors and the people that are, that we love, that we hold dear? And what will the consequences be of what we're going to make for the changes that have to happen to be able to prevent the worst of the things that have been outlined in front of us? Just an acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. David.
If you can hear me, I'm reminded of somebody's quote who suggested an effective strategy is to develop some sort of system which obsoletes the existing system. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're never going to have the time to develop the skills to be able to change corporate America from the inside. I don't see that as something that makes sense for QEW. I'm intrigued by the idea of wilderness. There isn't any, but at least there's little pieces of nature that still exist. For us to develop the kind of intuition that he was talking about by exposure to nature, it seems like QEW needs to be looking for and attempting to preserve what little bits of nature there still are in old growth forests, in wilderness. Those are the kinds of things that we might be able to be effective in our strategy on. Probably not at a federal level, but more likely at a local level. And pointing out to the society around us that those pieces of nature that still exist have things to teach us and are beautiful and affect our lives. If that makes sense.
Thank you, David. We have another David, David Terry.
Good morning, friends. 9:33 a.m. now in Wajak Noongar Boodja. Yeah, it was. I think I will have to try and get in contact with Daniel if I know he's a busy man, but his responses about governmental processes fascinate me, because I'm certainly fascinated in democratic, which seems to me like peaceful ways of, moving the Overton window, as it were, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and so on and so forth. I do think that 17th century Britain was a most fascinating time because, of course, it not only gave birth to friends, but in many ways it gave birth to at least the beginnings of democracy, where you basically had the parliament taking the power over the monarch. And I think it was you, Keith, who mentioned Hobbes and whatnot earlier, and there's a whole lot of changes here that are happening. So I personally am still holding the faith very much that democracy is still evolving. And so I sometimes say that Quakers are my spiritual community, which I dearly love. Golf is my other religion, because on the golf course, nearer to thee am I, my Lord, when I'm in that spiritual space. But I will say that modern representative democracy is my true religion, in the Latin sense of that word religion, which basically means bonding, what bonds us, And I know we are very symbolic. We work through symbolism a lot. And so I think my holy of holies is the two red lines down the center of the House of Commons, which are mythologically, as it were, two broadswords apart. Now, the symbolism of that is, if you are the Speaker in the House of Commons, to your right sits His Majesty's loyal government, and to your left sits His Majesty's loyal opposition. And so, they clash swords. But that's the essence of having to live in the age of reason, because if we are to live in the age of reason, we must live in the age of contention, rivalry, because reason can give a valid answer on both sides. And I know many friends here have spoken about, as it were, think locally, act globally, Now, warning, I may say something which upsets people here, okay? But I will say, first and foremost, I am very, very, very pro-choice, okay? And I can respect the United States Supreme Court's decision to make it a state thing. Okay, so I hope that doesn't upset anybody too much, but I would absolutely always go for pro-choice, but I see the reasoning in it. It's up to you folks individually, as states, or whatever the case may be locally, to decide what you as a community wish. And I think that is all the way through, but of course, coalescing that into a global public opinion as well is another matter. Anyway, enough from me. Thank you.
Leoma.
A couple of things. One, it seems to me that finding spaces for, like the scientific, the internal, all these different states doesn't seem to me like such a big conundrum. I think we might be well suited to find a way to honor all the different ones. Our practice with unity decision-making might help us be a place where we can help model the structure of honoring all the different ways of knowing, going with the basic fundamental belief that there is something larger and deeper than us holding us, and that we also are not wise enough to know more than part. I mean, we're wise enough to know the QEW needs more diversity to have more contention and more points of view, but and so that was one thing. And the other thing is I've been wondering, considering our size, I mean, I'm troubled by this idea that we need experts. Seems like a very sound idea. We need experts in how to be effective in the places that are controlling resources, which is essentially what the big corporations and governments are. They're channeling the way resources go. And but that's very daunting to get the amount of expertise to be effective there. So I'm just putting that up as, wow, because if we don't, maybe we won't get a chance to do where our strength is or where our contribution is. But the other last thing I wanted to put forward is this idea that's been playing with me about, as a complement to the gentle warrior, which Keith seems to be your archetype in some days at least, the humble holy trickster, which is the one who's and there are other archetypes that we might well embrace in there or invent, but the humble holy trickster is the one who is attuned to emergence. I've been wondering about emergence as a complement to good design, which is essential. How can QEW as a small organization catalyze emergence by being alert to places where a small group can shift conversations and connect groups? I mean, we're in our silo, we need to get out of it. How can we connect groups that, when put together, might come up with something we don't expect? I mean, I think there are ways that emergence can be encouraged, and there are ways in which it's being channeled towards emergence of pathways we all know too well from our history in terms of the rivalrous stuff that Daniel talked about, et cetera. But, yeah.
Well, I think our next person is Sue Ellen. Thank you, Liana.
I want to in general say that I keep wanting to say that friend speaks my mind. And what many of you have said, so thank you. I have heard maybe one thing, but I also may have misheard it, that concerns me. And I want to respond to the first query. So let me say that now, and then I can, because it relates to what concerned me. How could QEW respond with deep earnestness? I don't have it in front of me, but deep earnestness to what we just heard from Daniel. That's the way I'm going to truncate it. And I will say, by actually honoring, because we don't, and no progressive groups do, I think that's a blanket statement that I don't have the right to make, but we don't honor the study of effective strategy as much as we honor having a PhD in science. We don't honor that. And as a person who has been an organizer since I was 13 years old, I will tell you, the studies are out there. And what they tell you is you'd better read them. Because, for example, people always bring up the civil rights movement. Well, guys, read I've Got the Light of Freedom, that explained that it worked, those marches, to a large degree, not their only person. There's never one reason something works. To a large degree, because for 20 years, organizations went into the Black towns and did door-to-door canvassing. and had community meetings for 20 years before you saw any sit-ins and marches. Yet when people think they have studied effective strategy, they're looking at the surface. They haven't studied the effective strategy. And we do not, as I don't call myself a liberal anymore, because I call myself a lefty, because working class economic things are always in front of me. But what I'm going to say is, you can study it, but you can't study it just thinking you kind of know what people have said in a few places. You got to really find the studies. It took me years to find I've Got the Light of Freedom, and the Duke University professor who wrote it, and that's about those 20 years of door knocking. The Duke University professor who wrote it said, I have looked for this book for years, and I finally decided I had to write it. And so it is not easy, but we cannot tell ourselves surface things. If we wanted to change, if we wanted to be earnest, we would study effective strategy, but we'd really study it. The thing that has concerned me, two things. One has been the idea that if we play in some of the power circles to try to help things be better, and we can't be sure it'll save the world, but to do our best and play in some of this, we will be corrupt like corporations. I think I've heard that in various words more than once. No, that isn't at all necessary. Instead, what we need to do is, again, go to root cause and figure out why corporations have so much power. Well, partly, right, they have so much power because they've elected people who care so much about them. I mean, it was so different when I worked for Congress, when all the members of Congress, or a lot of them, had been put in by the anti-Vietnam War and the civil rights movements. You guys, it was a different world. And that's people. So we need to respect that power is a really honorable thing to do. And I will finally say, I do not believe conscience leads to action. I believe love of things like, as I said in my 5-year thing, looking in the eyes of a wolf. Not frankly, to be honest, I know I'll offend people talking about carbon credits, which I think are really important and stuff, because people just go, look in the eyes of the wolf and tell me if it's okay with you if those eyes go extinct, because you're approaching love. And what I want to say is that we need some love to help there be tactics. But as Daniel said about the 10,000 things put you in touch with the Tao, the knocking on the doors, the canvas is what is as valid for putting us in touch with spirit as sitting in a meeting for worship. And we don't really honor that. We don't. And I think because it is the story that I tried to find from organizing is people did a little bit, they were reinforced, and then they did a little bit more. So that door knocking or whatever is where God is, I believe.
I'll go ahead and share just a bit. My hand kept dropping. I think it's because my mic's off. And then Rebecca, I'll invite you, but I really did want to share just a bit that yeah, but there I think that Neoma both knows me well and says it well, that I think that the orientation towards this that I'm called to is something like the peaceful warrior, which is the one that's willing. That, there's some beautiful quotes from some very peaceful warriors in the Berrigan. I'm trying to remember his first name right now. There's a few, but essentially admonishing peacemakers, people who claim to be peacemakers, but who are unwilling to pay any significant price for that. and they, claim, I want peace, but they do it with half a heart and half a will. And because of that, the war continues, because all they really want is the velleities of peace. All they really want is peace in my little bubble, right? And I think as long as that's what we're going for, we're actually completely out of line with conscience. That's what I think gardening is a beautiful thing. I think rooting ourselves in that deep groundedness with the earth is so foundational to transforming ourselves and transforming the world. But if we're not stepping outside of our bubble, we're not aligned with God. We're not aligned with conscience. We're actually just faking it. We're middle-class white people wanting to feel good. And so I think I hope doesn't admonish people so much that they don't feel that every small thing you do makes a difference. Every little thing, even if you didn't step, you didn't bat your eyelashes to kill that little mite or whatever it is. Everything, even if you die tomorrow, the little things you did today made some difference. And so that's the ground that we work from, is that foundation. Everything makes a difference. But if I'm going to be true to our Quaker ancestry, and I'm going to give my life to God, I'm going to give my life to conscience, there can't be any ifs, cans, ands, and buts about that. It's actually everything is on the line. And that means I'm going to recognize that we do live in a world that's much more complicated than it was 100 years ago. And if humanity is going to be a good steward of this planet, we're probably going to need to be a little bit better at sense making what's going on. We're also going to get a lot better at solving our problems interrelationally with one another. We're going to have to get better at peacemaking. I think that the main thing I would say is, we were saying the problem is the institutions. The problem isn't the institutions. We don't have a global institution. It's complete rule of power by tooth and claw, and anarchy in its worst sense at the global level. That's not entirely true. The UN has been amazing. There's been things that have progressed us against that trend towards violence. And there's really earnest people fighting for that. But we need global cooperation if we want to be a wise steward of this planet. And to do that, we have to do deep peacemaking, not shallow, oh, why don't you just all get along kind of peacemaking, but like resolving historical trauma kind of peacemaking and creating peace between peoples. And then we have to, I think, humble ourselves before the living world that we're all a part, and realize that there's a wisdom implicit in all of this that is so much vaster than anything we have touch with. And if we're able to surrender ourselves to that and say, that's the prime objective, is just to be an instrument of that. That's, to me, what conscience would have me do. And I do think I would push back against Daniel. I didn't today, but I see, maybe it's just a mystical sense that the force of nonviolence is as of yet unrealized in its fullness in the world. And that's what I want to see QEW leaning into, not tomorrow, but today. And Rebecca, I'm realizing, sorry, thank you, Rebecca.
So I want to thank you. And I want to thank Sue Ellen. I think, Sue Ellen, you have a lot of wisdom about strategy for moving forward. But I really want us all to listen to one another by listening in tongues, because I'm going to speak to the first question. I don't usually come to these gatherings, but I really felt compelled after listening to a presentation Daniel spoke that was sent to me. So I came tonight. I'm a part of New England Yearly Meeting on Abenaki unceded territory, and in their Earthcare Ministry Committee. And number one, I've got 3 points. One is that the love of God however you interpret that, calms our fears, calms our fears. The second point, as a social scientist, I really believe in something that Keith just shared about we need to create places of trauma-informed gatherings that are part of our specialties as scientists, whether that be social or natural or physical sciences, whether that be as farmers or as pastors or as economists, whatever that is, to humbly sit together and listen for Spirit to talk to us deeply, and then come together and share those truths that we have discerned that will move us forward on a path that may be able to speak to some of those entities that know our language and would be able to hear us from the voice that we have that is somewhat unique as a people of faith. And lastly, live into those paradigms that we have discerned through the Spirit, that we don't have to keep doing what is being done. We can move in that new way, just like our early forebears moved in a different way than the culture around them. We can do the same. We can be known as those wacky Quakers that don't quite walk the same walk or talk the same talk. That was number 3. So anyway, thank you very much. Thank you for this program.
Well, I'm noticing that Juniper is on the move, but Chamba, Nora, and Juniper's hand is raised. Nora, were you wanting to share?
Yeah, sorry, Juniper was needing constant movement right now, and I wasn't going to be able to sink in if I was moving. So Dad took him for a second. I think what was really pulling at me, raising my hand, why I raised my hand was, I think that I actually don't want to frame it that way. I have a deep felt knowing. I'm not even going to say sense. I have a deeply felt knowing that Quakers are being called and have been for some time to get really uncomfortable. And I think that's been dawning on us slower than it should be, slower than it needs to be. I mean, I think there's, of course, I've heard echoes of that today already, but there's a deep discomfort that we need to step into. And I think QEW is a part of that. I think any moment that we feel righteous, we should question. And I heard that in Daniel's talk around, if you think you know, you're probably causing harm. we were having a conversation in this house. I think it was last night. My sense of time is a little weird since having a baby. But we were having a conversation about different cultures and different ways of just approaching things, and how what we think is like what's needed is coming from our own cultural frame. And I think those kinds of conversations are really important. But I think that we can't get too hung up on trying to be so perfect as to know everyone's cultural frame, as to know what's going to be the deep understanding that's underneath all of it. It's okay. We have our cultural frame. If someone came into our circle, they were like, well, for my cultural frame, this is what we understand. We wouldn't say, oh, well, let's go deeper than that, because that's cultural frame. That's not valid. We'd say, oh, thank you so much for bringing that. We need to get uncomfortable enough to say, this is my frame. This is where I'm coming from. And I'm a piece of the puzzle. And I'm going to step in. And that's uncomfortable. It's so uncomfortable to claim something, because when you claim something, you can be ostracized for it. And actually, you're going to have to change it. The moment you claim it, you have to change it. Because the moment you claim it, you start learning about it and you start learning about yourself. At least this is my experience of being human. And then it starts to shift. And how uncomfortable to be on shifting sand all the time. But I think that's where God wants us to go. I think that's where spirit always has lived. I think there's other things that come to me about the whole question of rite of passage and the frame of a rite of passage feels really powerful, but honestly, none of that is feeling very led for me to say. So I'm gonna stop there.
As your partner, I'm very moved. That was really powerful, honey. Thor.
Man, so many good people in talks tonight. I'm thoroughly impressed. I'm going to summon up the game of rock, paper, and scissors, because a lot of us would like to pick up a sword and battle it out, but that's just not politically correct anymore, especially in a democracy. So that we switch over the paper, and it's really a political legislative process, getting out the vote, going to door, getting the right people in Congress. And we already know what they're going to vote on. They're going to vote for reforms. They're going to do the right thing, or close enough. That's how representative democracy works. And some of us, well, let's just say rock is easier to break up than to change your mind. We've got brains. We soak up information. I was faced with a genetic condition. My son, I went into a medical library, no background in medicine. 10 hours later, I had the diagnosis. I can do those kind of mental gymnastics. Most people can't. Most people can't spend a couple hours a day just trying to keep current on what's going on out there in the science world. But I find hope in knowing what's going on, even if it's in the early stages, vanadium peroxide soaks up carbon dioxide. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not. But I'm sure it's going to be either replaced by something better or it will do. But that's the realm of people who spend 2 hours a day, every day, soaking up information, because that's something I'm good at. So I'm a rock, I know it. I'm a lousy politician, and I certainly don't want to go with a broadsword out there. But we got a system of domination. It's a kinder, gentler one. We see it in our housing. We see it in our financial system. We see it in our retirement system. And I love the problems we have in the United States solely because I know they're worse everywhere else I go in the world. So I'm just saying being aware is so powerful. And getting out and, if you're really going to say you love your neighbor, you're willing to get outside your little bubble. And I hear you say you love nature, but I really like meeting people that are really different than me. They think differently, they're culturally different. That's what's really going to change. And I think that is the singular strength of a group like this is we can get out and meet our neighbors. And we can make a persuasive story that, I think God calls us to be a servant. We are called to do the right thing. We're not supposed to be a reactionary. We're not supposed to be afraid of change. We don't have such set rules about the way it should be like it was in 1940. And that is, I think, the signature power of this group. I don't know. I'm really impressed.
Thank you, Thor. We'll keep in conversation. Alan.
Oh, I was kind of hoping you wouldn't call on me. I've been listening to everyone and really appreciating all the deep and moving wisdom and the and I feel like what I mostly have to bring is confusion, and I'm kind of wrestling deeply with a lot of what Daniel brought forth. But there's part of me that is pushing back against I found a lot of our conversations, but there's been little glimmerings of something else, but I found a lot of them tonight to be very human bounded. That when I look from my and it's really, I think, more my geological perspective than my Quaker perspective, this kind of pushing back on that when I look at nature, I don't see, well, competition is certainly the norm, but it's always eventually ultimately bounded. And cooperation is also the norm. And I think it's not just human bounded, but time bounded, but that in the rise of Western civilization, there was this domination mindset that emerged, and it's a fire. And the like a fire, it's burning, literally. I mean, every time we drive a car, we're burning the earth. And like all fires, it's Daniel referred to exponential growth a number of times. This is growing exponentially, that is growing exponentially. And I think for years, I taught my students that all exponential growth is ultimately self-limiting, that nothing can grow exponentially. And it's only in the last year that I realized that was wrong, that there's another kind of fire, that there are things, it's only things that consume that can't grow exponentially, things that produce, things that are generative, love, no wisdom. I won't say know-how governed by wisdom, that can grow exponentially. And so the question, the confusion, the thing I'm wrestling with, I keep having this image of Moses in the meeting the burning bush. And it was a burning with a fire that did not consume. And my theory of that, my thought of that has always been that what was transformational there was not that bush was any different than any other bush or any tree or any animal or any being, including us. is that Moses saw the life force in it. Whether there was some, sometimes I've looked at our redbud trees in spring and I've thought, oh, is that the burning bush? Is that that life force? And he recognized the spirit in that, the God, and he took off his shoes to make himself more like the bush, to grow, to find that deep rooting. And there he was, off in the wilderness. In some ways, I think we're one person meeting God. Yet he transformed the world from that experience. And I think that fire, and Jenny alluded to it, and other people have alluded to it, ultimately, I think it's love.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
So my question is, what kind of fire burns in us? I'll just leave it with that.
I was going to share something, when you were talking about cooperative and competitive forces. But I think, and I mean, Sue Ellen, if you feel called, please do share. But I'm thinking that might have been our moment. Just leave it with what Al said. So if you want to share, though, please do.
Well,
all right, Thor, if you're willing, is it just a final piece?
Yep, final piece, and it's kind of a prayer. I'm going to just relate that after my first son died, I gave thanks to him. I gave thanks for his life. I gave thanks for the influence it had on me. And it felt like the sky burned. So when I read that Moses saw the burning bush, I know he was in that mindset, to be thankful for the things that we all fear, the things that scare us, the things that challenge us. And I've never felt so in awe and so strong in my life as that day. And that's what I wish for you in all the challenges we face, that you look them in and understand them and give thanks for them. Because we are born in a time where there's great promise and great challenge. And if you are so blessed, the sky will burn for you.
I was going to post this in the chat, but I couldn't find it. I just didn't want to disturb the silence. But there's a prayer from Pema Chodron that she shares in her book, The Places That Scare You. And she says, "May the roots of all suffering diminish. May hatred, violence, addiction, and neglect also decrease. May we see all that separates us as insubstantial as our dreams. May we go to the places that scare us. May you be a warrior of light.